Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. In the world of literature, few stories have captured the imagination of readers as powerfully as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. First published in 1865, Lewis Carroll's novel has become one of the most enduring and beloved works in English literature. Its blend of whimsical storytelling, nonsensical logic, and vivid, unforgettable characters has enchanted generations of readers, from children to literary scholars. The book's origins are just as fascinating as the story itself. Lewis Carroll, whose real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, was a mathematician, photographer, and Oxford lecturer. He had a remarkable talent for wordplay and an unusual way of looking at the world, which he poured into his writing. The inspiration for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland came from a real-life boating trip in 1862, when Carroll entertained three young sisters, Lorena, Edith, and Alice Liddell, by spinning a tale of a curious girl who falls into a fantastical world. Alice Liddell, the middle sister, begged Carroll to write the story down, and thus, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was born. At first glance, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is a simple children's story filled with delightful absurdity and bizarre encounters. But beneath its playful surface lies a deeper exploration of logic, identity, and the strange unpredictability of the world. The novel's dreamlike structure defies traditional storytelling conventions, making it a precursor to surrealist literature. Carroll's use of riddles, paradoxes, and nonsense challenges the reader's perception of reality, often exposing the limitations of language and logic itself. The book has also been the subject of extensive interpretation and debate. Some scholars view it as a satire of Victorian society, particularly the rigid rules and nonsensical bureaucracy of the time. Others interpret it through a Freudian lens, analyzing its dreamlike qualities as reflections of the subconscious mind. Still, others see it as an exploration of childhood, imagination, and the process of growing up. Whatever the interpretation, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland remains a literary treasure, endlessly open to new readings. From its first publication, the book was a massive success. It has never been out of print and has been translated into hundreds of languages. Its influence extends beyond literature. Artists, filmmakers, musicians, and even psychologists have drawn inspiration from its curious world. Phrases like "down the rabbit hole" and "mad as a hatter" have entered the cultural lexicon, showing just how deeply Carroll's work has embedded itself into our collective imagination. Now, we embark on our own journey through Wonderland, following Alice as she steps into a world where nothing is as it seems, where logic is turned upside down, and where every encounter challenges her understanding of reality. Let's begin. Alice was beginning to grow tired of sitting by her sister on the riverbank. The day was warm, and she had nothing to do. Her sister's book had no pictures or conversations. What was the point of a book without pictures or conversations? As she sat there, feeling drowsy in the afternoon sun, she found herself wondering, almost aloud, whether it was worth the trouble of getting up and picking daisies to make a daisy chain. Before she could decide, something most unusual happened. A white rabbit ran past her. Not an ordinary rabbit, this one wore a waistcoat, and as it hurried by, it pulled out a pocket watch and exclaimed, "Oh dear, oh dear, I shall be late," Alice blinked. A talking rabbit, a rabbit with a watch. The strangeness of it startled her, but more than anything, it excited her curiosity. Without thinking, she jumped to her feet and ran after it, following it across the field. The rabbit disappeared down a large hole beneath a hedge, and without hesitating, Alice followed. She expected a short tunnel, something she could crawl through, but the ground beneath her gave way, and suddenly she was falling. At first, she was too surprised to think. Then, as the fall stretched on, she realized she had time to look around. The walls of the well were lined with cupboards, bookshelves, and strange objects. A jar labeled orange marmalade that, to her disappointment, was empty. She wondered how far she might be falling. Could she be going straight through the earth? Would she land among people who walked upside down? Down, down, down she fell, until suddenly she landed with a soft thump on a pile of dry leaves. She was unhurt, and before she could gather her thoughts, she saw the white rabbit hurrying ahead through a long hallway. "Oh, my ears and whiskers, how late it's getting," he muttered. Alice ran after him, but soon lost sight of him as he disappeared around a corner. She found herself in a large hall with many doors, all locked. At the center of the hall was a glass table, and on it, a tiny golden key. She eagerly picked it up and tried the doors, but the key fit none of them. Then she noticed a small curtain at the base of the wall. Pulling it aside, she found a tiny door, so small she would have to crawl on her hands and knees to pass through it. The key fit perfectly. Peering through, she saw the loveliest garden, bright flowers, cool fountains, green hedges. She longed to go there, but she was much too large to fit through the door. As she looked back at the table, she noticed a little bottle that hadn't been there before. It was labeled "Drink Me." Alice hesitated. It was not wise to drink things without knowing what they were, but there was no warning on the bottle, and curiosity got the better of her. She took a sip. A strange feeling washed over her, as if she were shrinking like a telescope being folded up. In a moment, she was no taller than 10 inches, just the right size for the little door. But when she tried to open it, she realized she had left the key on the table. Now she was too small to reach it. She felt like crying, but scolded herself. There was no use in crying over things she couldn't change. Then she noticed a small cake on the floor, with the words "Eat me" neatly written in currants. If it makes me smaller, I can slip under the door. If it makes me bigger, I can reach the key, she reasoned. Either way, it would help. She took a bite. At once, she began growing, her arms, legs, and neck stretching unnaturally. In moments, she was enormous. Her head nearly touched the ceiling, and her foot accidentally kicked over the little table. The golden key was now utterly out of reach. Alice sat down and began to cry. Her giant tears splashed onto the floor, forming puddles. "I wish I hadn't drunk so much," she sighed. Just then, she heard the sound of tiny footsteps. The white rabbit had returned, muttering to himself about how the Duchess would have him executed if he was late. He was dressed more finely now, with white gloves in one hand and a fan in the other. Alice, desperate for help, called out, "Please, sir." The rabbit jumped in fright, dropped his gloves and fan, and scurried away. Alice picked up the fan and, fanning herself, felt herself shrinking again. Before she knew it, she was back to her small size. But now the door was still locked, and the key was lost in the vastness of the hall. Worse still, she was now standing in a great pool of water. She quickly realized the pool was made of her own tears. As she swam, she saw all sorts of creatures floating beside her, birds, mice, and even a dodo. They too were trapped in the flood. Alice approached a mouse and attempted to make conversation. "You know how to get out of here?" she asked. The mouse twitched its whiskers. "Perhaps if we dry off, we can think better," it said. The animals all agreed, and they paddled toward the shore, dripping wet. Once on dry land, the dodo, who seemed to consider himself the leader, declared that the best way to dry off was to run a race, where everyone would start and stop whenever they pleased, and there would be no clear winner. Alice had never heard of such a thing, but she joined in, running in circles with the animals. Finally, the dodo announced that they were all dry and therefore all winners. "And as winners, we must have prizes," he declared. He turned to Alice. "What do you have in your pocket?" Alice checked and found nothing but a single piece of candy. She handed it over, and the dodo solemnly gave it back to her as a prize. The other animals applauded. But before Alice could ask any more questions, the white rabbit rushed by once more. This time, he was even more frantic. "Oh dear, my gloves, my fan. The Duchess will have me executed." Seeing Alice, he mistook her for a servant. "Mary Ann, what are you doing standing about? Fetch my gloves at once." Without waiting for a reply, he dashed off, leaving Alice thoroughly confused. Who was Mary Ann, and why was he acting as if she worked for him? Yet, something about Wonderland made her hesitate to question things too much. Perhaps it was easier to go along with the madness. So, without another word, she followed the white rabbit once more. Alice followed the white rabbit as he hurried anxiously through the strange corridors of Wonderland, mumbling about his missing gloves and fan. Before she could protest that she wasn't Mary Ann, whoever that was, he pointed toward a small house in the distance and ordered her inside. "Go fetch my things at once," he commanded, before rushing off again. Alice hesitated. She wasn't used to being given orders, especially from talking rabbits, but Wonderland seemed to follow its own peculiar logic. She decided it was easier to go along with things for now. She approached the little house and stepped inside. The room was tidy, with a small dressing table near the window. Sure enough, there was a fan and a pair of gloves lying neatly on the table. As she reached for them, her eyes landed on another curious object, a small bottle, much like the one she had drunk from earlier. This one had no label, but Wonderland had already filled her with such strange curiosity that she took a sip without thinking. Instantly, she felt the familiar sensation of growing. This time, however, it was much faster and much more alarming. Her arms and legs stretched out, knocking over furniture, and before she knew it, her head was pressed uncomfortably against the ceiling. She was now so enormous that she could barely move within the little house. Alice panicked. She tried to shrink herself back down, but there was no cake or bottle in sight to reverse the effect. She was stuck. Worse still, the white rabbit had returned, impatiently tapping his foot outside. "Mary Ann, what is taking you so long?" he shouted. He pushed open the door, but upon seeing Alice's enormous form blocking the entire house, he let out a terrified squeak and bolted. Moments later, Alice heard a commotion outside. A group of Wonderland creatures had gathered, led by a nervous-looking rabbit and a large, pompous-sounding voice. "We must get her out," the voice declared. Fetch Bill. Bill, it seemed, was a small lizard who had the unfortunate job of being sent down the chimney to remove Alice. She heard the creatures outside discussing their plan, and before she could call out to stop them, she felt a scuffling sound from above. A tiny clawed foot slid down the chimney, followed by a nervous whimper. Bill had been shoved in against his will. Alice, feeling mischievous, stretched out her foot and gave the chimney a light kick. With a surprised yelp, Bill shot back up like a rocket. There was a flurry of movement outside, followed by concerned whispers. That won't do at all. What if we smoke her out? Alice, overhearing this, felt a rising sense of alarm. She didn't particularly want to be smoked out like a wild animal. She wriggled as best as she could in her cramped position, trying to find a way to shrink. Then she saw it, a small piece of cake sitting on the floor near her enormous foot. Without hesitation, she reached for it and took a bite. At once, she began shrinking again. She sighed with relief as her body returned to its normal size. But before she could compose herself, she heard the patter of footsteps outside. The creatures were preparing to charge inside. Not wanting another encounter with the frantic white rabbit or his strange companions, Alice darted out the door and ran into the woods before anyone could stop her. She ran until she could no longer hear the commotion behind her. Finally, she paused to catch her breath, realizing she had no idea where she was. Wonderland's landscape was ever-changing trees twisted at strange angles, paths curved in nonsensical directions, and peculiar mushrooms sprouted from the ground like miniature umbrellas. Not knowing what else to do, she picked a path and began walking. Soon, she came across a large mushroom, on top of which sat a peculiar creature, a blue caterpillar, lazily smoking a hookah. He regarded Alice with sleepy, half-lidded eyes, exhaling slow clouds of smoke. "Who are you?" he asked in a slow, dreamy voice. Alice hesitated. It was an odd question, but then again, everything about Wonderland was odd. I hardly know, sir," she admitted. "I was much larger earlier today, then smaller, then large again. I don't feel quite like myself at all." The caterpillar took another long puff of his hookah. "Explain yourself," he said. "I can't," Alice said honestly. "At least, I don't think I can. I'm not even sure who I am anymore." The caterpillar considered this. "You will get used to it," he said simply. Alice frowned. This was not particularly helpful advice. After a moment, the caterpillar finally offered her something more useful. "One side of the mushroom will make you taller," he said, gesturing with one of his many arms. "The other will make you shorter." Alice brightened. At last, a way to control her size. She broke off 2 small pieces of the mushroom, taking a careful nibble from one. Instantly, her neck shot upward like a telescope, stretching so high that she could see over the tops of the trees. She gasped in alarm. Before she could panic too much, she nibbled the other piece. Slowly, her neck shrank back down to normal. Now, feeling a bit more in control, Alice pocketed both pieces. Who knew when she might need them again? Thanking the caterpillar, who had already lost interest in her, she continued walking, eager to find her way out of the strange forest. Before long, she came across a small clearing where a house stood. The house was peculiar, not because of its shape, but because of the sound coming from inside. Loud sneezes, crashes, and a baby wailing filled the air. Smoke billowed out of the chimney, and from the open window, Alice could see a very unusual sight, a woman in a tattered apron. stirring a large cauldron of soup while holding a baby that squirmed in her arms. The baby sneezed violently, and at that moment, Alice realized the entire kitchen was filled with an overpowering amount of pepper. Sitting nearby, watching the chaos unfold, was a grinning Cheshire cat. Its wide, mischievous smile seemed to float in the air, and as Alice locked eyes with it, she had the peculiar sensation that it could see right through her. Wonderland was only growing stranger, and Alice had the distinct feeling that things were about to become even more bizarre. Alice stood in the doorway of the peculiar little house, hesitating as she took in the scene before her. The kitchen was in utter chaos. Thick clouds of pepper hung in the air, making Alice's nose itch just from standing near the entrance. The Duchess, a haggard woman with sharp features, stood over a bubbling cauldron, stirring furiously as she sneezed between her muttered grumblings. In her arms, she cradled a wailing baby whose face was scrunched up in perpetual distress. At the far end of the kitchen, a cook stirred another pot, tossing ingredients into it with wild abandon, handfuls of pepper, pots, pans, anything that came within reach. The Duchess seemed utterly unbothered by this. In fact, she seemed to encourage the madness. The baby let out another violent sneeze, followed by an alarming shriek that sounded less human than one might expect. Alice, unsure of what to do, cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said politely, though the Duchess hardly seemed to notice her at first. "I couldn't help but wonder what is the matter with your baby." The Duchess turned her head sharply. "Matter?" she snapped. "Everything's the matter and nothing's the matter. That's just how things are, child." She gave the baby a rough shake, which only made it wail louder. Alice, feeling a surge of concern, stepped forward. "Perhaps you should read the rules," the Duchess interrupted. Alice blinked in confusion. "What rules?" The Duchess did not answer. Instead, she began reciting a strange little rhyme, her voice rising and falling with an odd, unpredictable rhythm. "Speak roughly to your little boy and beat him when he sneezes. He only does it to annoy because he knows it teases." Alice's mouth fell open. "That's a horrible song," she protested. "Is it?" The Duchess gave a lazy shrug. "Oh well, off you go." Without another word, she thrust the baby into Alice's arms and turned back to her cauldron, as if the matter were settled. Alice stumbled backward under the unexpected weight of the baby, who immediately let out a series of deep, snuffling sounds. Its face twisted in an odd expression, and for the first time, Alice noticed something peculiar. It had a rather upturned snout. The baby's noises grew stranger, its body squirming more violently. Its arms and legs kicked out in a way that did not seem entirely human. And before Alice could fully process what was happening, she realized with growing alarm that the baby was turning into a pig. Its nose had stretched, its ears had changed shape, and its small hands curled into cloven hooves. Alice gasped. "Oh, you poor thing." The Duchess and cook took no notice. In fact, the cook had started throwing dishes now, smashing them against the walls in apparent glee. Alice didn't want to stick around any longer. She clutched the pig baby to her chest and hurried out of the chaotic kitchen, stepping into the fresh air of Wonderland's ever-shifting landscape. Once she had put some distance between herself and the house, she carefully set the pig down. It gave a happy little grunt and trotted off into the woods, as if relieved to finally embrace its true form. Alice wiped her hands and sighed. "I suppose that's for the best," she murmured. She barely had time to collect her thoughts before she noticed something strange in the air. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a shimmer, a trick of the light. But then she realized it was a smile. A wide, mischievous grin, floating in the air with no visible body attached. And then, piece by piece, the rest of the Cheshire cat appeared. Its large, luminous eyes twinkled with amusement, as though it found Alice's confusion terribly entertaining. "Cheshire Puss," Alice said hesitantly, deciding it was best to be polite. "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" The cat stretched, its stripes rippling as it shifted positions. "That depends a great deal on where you want to get to," it said, grinning wider. Alice frowned. "I don't much care where, so long as I get somewhere." "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if you only walk long enough." Alice sighed. "But how do I know which way is best?" The Cheshire cat swished its tail thoughtfully. "Well, that way," it pointed a claw in one direction, "leads to the Hatter. And that way," it pointed to another, "leads to the March Hare. Visit either, they're both mad." Alice wasn't entirely sure she wanted to meet any more mad creatures, but her curiosity got the better of her. "But I don't want to go among mad people," she said. "Oh, you can't help that," the cat replied. "We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad." Alice tilted her head. "How do you know I'm mad?" "You must be," said the cat, as though it were the simplest fact in the world, "or you wouldn't have come here." Alice couldn't argue with that, so she changed the subject. "What sort of people are the Hatter and the March Hare?" "The Hatter is always having tea," the cat said, stretching lazily. "And the March Hare is quite mad. But then again, so is the Hatter. Tea time never ends for them. Quite a miserable existence, really." Alice pondered this. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted to meet someone trapped in an endless tea party, but she had no better options. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose I'll see the Hatter." The cat's grin widened. "Excellent choice. Oh, and one more thing," before Alice could ask what it meant. The Cheshire cat's body slowly faded away until only its grin remained in the air. Then that too vanished. Alice shook her head. Wonderland was growing stranger by the minute, and she had a feeling the next part of her journey would be even more peculiar. With no other path available, she turned toward the direction the cat had indicated and set off, her mind full of questions about what kind of madness lay ahead at the tea party. Alice walked through the winding paths of Wonderland, her thoughts still lingering on the Cheshire cat's words. "We're all mad here." She had encountered strange creatures before, but there was something about Wonderland's madness that felt different, like a dream that kept shifting before she could understand it. Before long, she spotted a clearing in the distance. At the center of it stood a long table, set for tea, though it appeared far too large for the three figures gathered at one end. One of them was a hare, his fur unkempt, his ears twitching restlessly. The other was a man in a large, battered hat, whose eyes gleamed with an odd intensity. Between them sat a small, sleepy-looking creature curled up in a teapot, the dormouse. The Hatter was the first to notice Alice's approach. "No room, no room," he called out before she even reached the table. Alice frowned, glancing at the many empty seats. "There's plenty of room," she said, sitting down anyway. The March Hare, eyeing her suspiciously, reached for a teapot and poured some tea straight into his own plate. The dormouse stirred slightly in his teapot bed, but didn't wake up. The Hatter leaned toward Alice. "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" he asked abruptly. Alice blinked. I don't know why," the Hatter grinned. "Ah, you don't know. That's unfortunate." He rocked back in his chair, looking pleased with himself. Alice frowned. "You mean you don't know the answer either?" "I haven't the slightest idea," the Hatter admitted cheerfully. The March Hare chuckled, and the Dormouse muttered something incomprehensible in its sleep. Alice was beginning to feel that this was a very foolish tea party. She reached for a cup of tea, but the March Hare snatched it away. "I think you should say what you mean," Alice said, feeling irritated. "I do," said the March Hare. "At least, I mean what I say. It's the same thing." "Not the same thing at all," Alice argued. "You might as well say, I see what I eat is the same as I eat what I see." The Hatter clapped his hands. "Bravo! We have a logician among us," Alice sighed, realizing she wasn't going to get anywhere with them. She decided to change the subject. "What do you mean by saying you have tea all the time?" "It's always tea time," the Hatter said solemnly. Alice stared at him. "Always?" The Hatter nodded. "Time has been quite upset with me, you see. Ever since I had a little disagreement with him, he refuses to let us move past 6 o'clock. Alice had never thought of time as a person before, but in Wonderland, anything seemed possible. "So you're stuck at tea time forever?" "Precisely," the Hatter said, taking a sip of tea. Alice thought about this. A never-ending tea party sounded rather unpleasant, and she was already growing tired of the nonsense. She was just about to excuse herself when the Dormouse suddenly stirred and opened its sleepy eyes. "Tell us a story," the March Hare demanded, nudging the Dormouse. Alice perked up. Perhaps this would be interesting. The Dormouse yawned. "Once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters who lived at the bottom of a well. Their names were Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly." Alice leaned forward. "What did they live on?" "They lived on treacle," the Dormouse murmured. Alice frowned. "Treacle? That's impossible. One cannot live on treacle alone." The Dormouse didn't seem bothered by her logic. "They did," it said simply. The March Hare poured more tea onto his saucer, and the Hatter tried to dip a watch into his cup, muttering something about it being too dry. Alice realized she had heard quite enough. "This is the silliest tea party I've ever been to," she declared, standing up. The Hatter barely glanced at her. "Come back when you know the answer to the riddle." "I won't." Alice huffed and walked off, leaving the tea party behind. As she wandered away from the clearing, she felt more frustrated than ever. She had hoped to find something sensible in Wonderland, but the deeper she went, the stranger it all became. Soon, she found herself before a large tree with a door in its trunk. This seemed unusual even for Wonderland. Curious, she stepped inside and found herself in a long hallway, the very same hallway from the beginning of her adventure. Her heart leaped. The tiny door, the garden, she hurried forward, determined not to make the same mistake twice. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a piece of the mushroom the caterpillar had given her. Carefully, she took a nibble. Instantly, she began to shrink. This time, she was ready for it. When she was small enough, she approached the little door and used the golden key to unlock it. Pushing it open, she gasped. Before her was the most beautiful garden she had ever seen: lush green hedges, vibrant flowers, sparkling fountains. It was exactly where she had wanted to go from the beginning. With a delighted laugh, she stepped inside. Alice stepped eagerly into the garden, finally reaching the place she had longed to see since she first laid eyes on the tiny door. The air was filled with the scent of blooming roses, and hedges twisted into elaborate shapes, giving the entire space an enchanted feel. However, As she wandered through the garden, she noticed something peculiar. 3 playing card-shaped figures were crouched over a rose bush, painting its white roses red. Alice watched in fascination. These creatures were living cards, flat but fully animated, dressed in suits like those found in a deck. 2 of them bore the number 5 and 7, while the third, 2, looked especially nervous as he dabbed at the petals with a dripping brush. Curious, Alice stepped closer. "Why are you painting the roses?" she asked. The cards jumped in surprise, nearly dropping their brushes. 2 of them exchanged nervous glances before the one labeled 2 whispered in a hushed tone, "We planted the wrong roses." "The queen wanted red ones," 5 added grimly. "But we accidentally planted white ones," 7 muttered. "And if she finds out?" Alice didn't need them to finish their sentence. She had already seen enough of Wonderland to know that its rulers were likely unpredictable and dangerous. Before she could ask another question, a trumpet sounded in the distance, and the card gardeners instantly stiffened in terror. "She's coming," 2 hissed, throwing his brush aside in a panic. Alice turned toward the sound. From the far end of the garden, a grand procession was approaching. Leading the way were more living playing cards, marching in perfect formation. Following them came courtiers, creatures of all sorts, and a group of royal figures. At the very front, towering over the rest, was the Queen of Hearts. Alice had never seen anyone look quite so fierce. The Queen's face was flushed with a deep red, and her expression was one of constant rage, as though she were permanently on the verge of shouting. She was dressed in a regal gown covered in heart patterns, her heavy skirts sweeping the ground as she walked. Beside her was the King of Hearts, who was much smaller and seemed far less important. He mostly trailed along behind her, nodding meekly at everything she said. The Queen's sharp eyes swept across the garden, immediately locking onto the trembling cards in front of the rosebush. "What is this?" she bellowed. "Who has been painting my roses?" The 3 card gardeners instantly fell to their knees, trembling so violently that Alice thought they might faint on the spot. The Queen's expression darkened, and she drew herself up to her full height. "Off with their heads," she shrieked. Alice gasped. "That's ridiculous." She blurted out before she could stop herself. A stunned silence followed. The Queen turned sharply to look at Alice, her expression a mixture of surprise and outrage. The entire procession seemed to freeze, waiting to see what would happen next. "Who?" the Queen demanded, stepping closer. "Are you?" Alice swallowed but held her ground. "My name is Alice," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. The Queen narrowed her eyes. "And do you play croquet?" Alice blinked at the sudden change of subject. "Yes, I suppose I do." "Then you shall play with us immediately," the Queen declared. Without waiting for a response, she clapped her hands, and the entire procession began moving again, leading Alice across the garden toward an open croquet ground. As Alice followed along, she noticed how strange the croquet setup was. The field was uneven, full of hills and dips, making it difficult to walk, let alone play a game. But the strangest part was the equipment. There were no proper mallets or balls. Instead, live flamingos were used as mallets, their long necks held out straight, while the balls were hedgehogs that curled up tightly whenever they were placed on the ground. Even stranger, the hoops through which the balls were meant to pass were not hoops at all, but rather living playing cards that bent themselves into arch shapes. Alice hesitantly picked up a flamingo, struggling to keep its neck straight as it wriggled in her grasp. She placed a hedgehog on the ground and prepared to strike it, but before she could, the hedgehog uncurled and scurried away. "This is impossible," she muttered. All around her, the game was descending into chaos. The queen shouted furiously at anyone who played poorly, often screaming, "Off with their heads," at random intervals. The soldiers acting as hoops kept standing up and walking away, making it impossible to aim properly. The flamingos refused to cooperate, frequently twisting their necks at the last second so that players missed their shots. Alice had never seen such a disorderly game in her life, yet no one seemed to question it. Instead, they played on as though nothing were amiss, occasionally pausing to bow whenever the queen glanced their way. As she struggled with her turn, Alice suddenly noticed something strange in the air above her. At first, it was just a faint shimmer, but then, with a slow, deliberate grin, the Cheshire Cat's face appeared. "Having fun?" it asked, its wide grin stretching further. Alice sighed. "Not particularly." "I thought you might enjoy a little madness," the cat teased. Alice glanced toward the queen, who was now yelling at a trembling courtier. "She's completely unreasonable," Alice whispered. "She keeps shouting off with their heads every other minute." The Cheshire Cat chuckled. "She never actually executes anyone, you know. She just likes the drama." Alice frowned. "Still, it's quite dreadful." Before the cat could respond, the queen suddenly turned and spotted Alice talking to what appeared to be thin air. Her eyes narrowed. "Who are you speaking to?" she demanded. Alice hesitated. "A friend of mine," she said carefully. The queen's expression darkened. "I don't see anyone." At that moment, the Cheshire Cat's body faded into view, hovering just above the queen's head. The King of Hearts noticed first and let out a startled squeak. The queen gasped. "Who dares appear uninvited?" The Cheshire Cat's grin widened. "I appear wherever I please, Your Majesty." The queen turned red with rage. "Off with its head," she shrieked. But the Cheshire Cat only chuckled. "You can't cut off a head without a body," it pointed out. The queen stomped her foot. "Then fetch the executioner." At this, the entire court fell into chaos, with courtiers running in different directions to find the executioner. The cat simply floated above it all, watching with amusement. Alice knew this was the perfect moment to slip away. Taking a deep breath, she turned and quietly hurried toward the edge of the garden, hoping to escape before the queen turned her attention back to her. As she ran, she could still hear the queen shouting orders behind her, but she didn't stop. Wonderland was proving to be more dangerous by the minute, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep herself from getting caught up in its madness. Alice hurried away from the croquet game, her heart pounding as she left behind the queen's chaotic court. The Cheshire Cat had vanished once again, leaving her alone in the twisting hedges of the royal garden. She had no clear idea of where she was going, but anywhere seemed safer than staying under the queen's wrath. As she moved through the garden, she heard distant voices and soon found herself in front of a grand castle door. The heavy wooden doors stood ajar, leading into a vast hallway. Curiosity got the better of her, and she stepped inside, finding herself in what appeared to be a courtroom. A large jury box was filled with various Wonderland creatures, birds, hedgehogs, and lizards, all scribbling furiously on slates, though many of them seemed unsure of what they were writing. At the center of it all sat the King and Queen of Hearts, presiding over what looked like a very serious trial. Alice had barely taken a step inside when a loud voice rang out. "Call the first witness." She turned to see the White Rabbit, now dressed in an official-looking coat, standing at the front of the courtroom, holding a trumpet and a long scroll. Alice had seen plenty of peculiar things in Wonderland, but the sight of the nervous little rabbit acting as a court official was certainly among the oddest. The first witness was called forward, a trembling, furry creature Alice recognized as the Mad Hatter. He stepped up hesitantly, clutching his hat, and gave a deep bow to the king and queen. The king adjusted his crown and cleared his throat. "You may begin," he said in an important tone. I'm just a poor hatter, Your Majesty," the hatter stammered. "I don't know anything about the case." "Then why were you called as a witness?" the king asked sternly. The White Rabbit fumbled with his scroll. "He was found drinking tea at the time of the crime," he explained. The queen scowled. "That's suspicious." Off with his head. The hatter went pale and clutched his hat even tighter. But I haven't done anything wrong." "Then you may go," the king said hurriedly, before the queen could insist on an execution. The hatter didn't need to be told twice. He bolted from the courtroom, nearly knocking over the March Hare and the Dormouse as he fled. Alice couldn't help but wonder what crime was being tried. She leaned closer to one of the jurors, a small lizard, to ask, but before she could whisper a question, the White Rabbit's voice rang out again. "The next witness, Alice." Alice jumped. "Me." She had no time to protest. A pair of playing card guards appeared at her side, ushering her forward until she stood in front of the king and queen. She could feel every eye in the courtroom on her, and it made her distinctly uncomfortable. "What do you know about this case?" the king asked. Alice frowned. "I don't even know what this case is about." The king looked flustered. He shuffled through a stack of papers before declaring, "The trial concerns the theft of the queen's tarts." Alice nearly laughed. "Tarts?" The queen glared at her. "Yes, tarts. Someone has stolen them, and we must find the culprit." Alice thought this was an awfully silly thing to hold a trial over, but she wisely kept that thought to herself. Instead, she looked around the room. "And who is being accused?" The White Rabbit hesitated, then unrolled his scroll dramatically. "The Knave of Hearts," he announced. Alice turned toward the accused. The Knave of Hearts stood silently, looking rather miserable as he was surrounded by guards. He didn't say a word in his defense, nor did anyone seem particularly interested in what he had to say. "Do you have any evidence?" the king asked. The White Rabbit straightened up. "A letter has been found, Your Majesty," he declared, holding up a small envelope. Alice was curious now. "What does it say?" The White Rabbit cleared his throat and began to read. "They told me you had been to her and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim." There was a long pause. The king nodded solemnly. "That is very clear evidence indeed." Alice was baffled. "But it doesn't mean anything." The queen scowled at her. "If it doesn't mean anything, then we may as well skip the trial and move straight to the sentence." Alice's frustration grew. "You can't have a sentence before a verdict," she protested. "Sentence first, verdict afterward," the queen snapped. "That's absurd," Alice cried. "That's not how trials work at all." The queen's face turned red with rage. "Off with her head," she screamed. Alice stood her ground. She wasn't afraid anymore. In fact, she was beginning to feel strange, larger, stronger. She looked down at herself and realized she was growing again, just like before. The courtroom around her seemed to shrink as she stretched taller and taller. until the playing cards at her feet looked as small as scraps of paper. "You can't hurt me," Alice said firmly. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." At her words, the entire courtroom erupted into chaos. The playing cards, the king, the queen, the jury, all of them suddenly rose into the air, swirling around Alice like a great storm of paper. She shielded her eyes as they came closer and closer, their edges sharp and fluttering. And then she woke up. Alice blinked and gasped, finding herself lying on the grass beneath the shade of a tree. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, and in the distance, she could hear the lazy sounds of the river. She sat up quickly, her heart still racing. Where had the courtroom gone? Where was the queen, the Cheshire cat, the hatter? But there was nothing. Just the warm summer day and the sound of the real world around her. Alice turned and saw her sister sitting nearby, reading a book. "Wake up, Alice," her sister said gently. "You've been asleep for quite some time." Alice looked around once more, half expecting to see a white rabbit dashing through the grass. But everything was normal again. Had it all been a dream? She wasn't sure. But as she brushed herself off and stood up, she couldn't help but smile. Wonderland had changed her in ways she couldn't quite explain, and even if it had all been a dream, she knew she would never forget it. Alice stood up slowly, brushing off her dress as the warmth of the real world settled around her. The dream, if it was a dream, still lingered vividly in her mind. The Queen's trial, the absurd rules, the whirlwind of playing cards, and that strange sensation of growing until everything around her seemed insignificant. She turned to her sister, who continued reading, oblivious to Alice's extraordinary journey. As Alice gazed into the distance, her thoughts drifted back to Wonderland. It was hard to shake the feeling that the world she had just escaped still existed, lurking just beyond her reach. The Cheshire cat's grin, the Mad Hatter's nonsensical riddles, the White Rabbit's frantic urgency. It all seemed too real to simply be a dream. Yet here she was, back in the normal world, where time flowed properly and rules made sense. Her sister, noticing Alice's faraway expression, smiled gently. "You must have been dreaming about something wonderful," she said, closing her book for a moment. Alice hesitated, wondering if she should tell her. But where would she even begin? How could she explain a world where logic twisted and turned, where cats vanished and queens sentenced people to death over tarts? It all sounded absurd. And yet, wasn't there something magical about the absurdity? She shook her head slightly and sat back down beside her sister, staring at the pages of the book in her lap. The words blurred before her eyes as memories of Wonderland flickered in her mind like the shifting colors of a sunset. She could still hear the voices, some friendly, some maddening, all unforgettable. The caterpillar, with his slow, deliberate speech, asking her who she was. The Duchess, spouting nonsense as she bounced a squealing baby that turned into a pig. The mock turtle, sighing as he recounted his melancholic lessons. The Mad Hatter and March Hare, oh, what a pair they had been. Their tea party had made no sense at all, and yet Alice had found herself caught up in the rhythm of their riddles and peculiar customs. She could almost hear the Hatter's voice now. Why is a raven like a writing desk? She had never found out the answer. Perhaps there wasn't one. Perhaps that was the point. And then, of course, there was the Queen of Hearts. How fiercely she had ruled her strange kingdom, throwing out death sentences as easily as one might swat a fly. Off with their heads, she had cried at every turn, and yet no heads had actually rolled. It was all bluster, all empty threats. Even in the wildest, most chaotic moments of Wonderland, there had been a strange sense of safety, as though nothing could truly harm her. Alice sighed. Had she really been afraid in Wonderland? Looking back, she wasn't so sure. Things had been frustrating, confusing, sometimes even frightening, but deep down, she had never truly felt that she was in danger. It was as if some unspoken rule of Wonderland kept her protected, even when everything around her seemed to crumble into madness. Her sister's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You look lost in another world, Alice." Alice blinked and turned to her. "I suppose I am." Her sister chuckled. "Perhaps one day you'll tell me about it." Alice smiled but said nothing. Some things, she thought, were meant to be kept as secrets, tucked away like treasures in the corners of one's mind. She would always remember Wonderland, the adventure, the strangeness, the delight of stepping into a world where nothing was as it seemed. And maybe, just maybe, she would return there one day. For now, though, the sun was setting, and reality was calling her back. She took one last, lingering look at the horizon, then settled beside her sister, listening to the rustling of the pages as the evening stretched before them. As Alice sat beside her sister, listening to the gentle rustling of pages, she couldn't help but let her mind drift once more. Wonderland had been so vivid, so tangible, that it seemed impossible to believe it was nothing more than a dream. Every character she had encountered, every strange conversation, every absurd rule, it had all felt real in a way that the ordinary world around her somehow did not. She turned to her sister, who was still engrossed in her book. The contrast between them struck Alice at that moment. Her sister was content in the logical, structured world of books and reality, while Alice felt as though she had glimpsed something far beyond that, a place where logic twisted into nonsense, where the impossible happened as naturally as breathing. Her sister had often told her to grow up, to stop being so curious, to stop asking so many questions. But if Wonderland had taught Alice anything, it was that curiosity was not something to be abandoned. If anything, it was what made life worth living. After all, wasn't it curiosity that had led her to chase the white rabbit in the first place? She closed her eyes for a moment, letting her thoughts wander. She remembered the strange, floating grin of the Cheshire cat, the way he had appeared and disappeared as if reality itself bent to his will. She thought of the caterpillar, with his slow, deliberate voice, challenging her to explain who she was. And the Mad Hatter, his tea party had been completely nonsensical. And yet, hadn't there been a certain logic hidden beneath all the chaos? Alice sighed, realizing how much she had changed. Before Wonderland, she had seen the world in a very particular way, one where things had proper rules and followed a set order. But Wonderland had turned all of that on its head. It had shown her that rules could be arbitrary, that authority figures were not always right, and that sometimes the best thing to do was to question everything. The Queen of Hearts, for example, had seemed powerful, terrifying even. Yet, in the end, Alice had realized that her power was nothing more than an illusion. All it had taken was one moment of clarity, one act of defiance, to reveal that the Queen was nothing more than a tyrant with no real control over anything. Wonderland had been full of such illusions, and now, sitting in the real world, Alice couldn't help but wonder if reality was any different. What if the people who claimed to be in charge were just as ridiculous as the Queen? What if the rules everyone followed were just as arbitrary as the ones in Wonderland? What if the only difference between Wonderland and reality was that people in the real world didn't realize how strange their own rules were? Alice opened her eyes and looked up at the sky. The sun was beginning to set. casting long golden shadows across the grass. The world around her was quiet, peaceful, familiar. And yet, something inside her had changed. She wasn't sure she would ever look at things quite the same way again. She thought about the white rabbit, always in a hurry, always worried about time. She had spent so much of her adventure chasing after him, trying to keep up, trying to understand where he was going. But did it really matter? Did the destination even exist? Or had the chase itself been the point all along? Perhaps that was the real lesson of Wonderland, not to reach some final answer, but to keep asking questions, to keep chasing after the unknown. Wonderland had been a place of endless surprises, where nothing stayed the same for long. And maybe, in its own strange way, it had been trying to teach her that life was the same. Her sister glanced up from her book and smiled. "You're awfully quiet, Alice. What are you thinking about?" Alice hesitated, then shook her head with a small smile. "Oh, nothing," she said, though she knew it wasn't true. She would always remember Wonderland, and though she might not return there, she knew that a piece of it would always stay with her. Alice remained seated in the soft grass, the quiet sounds of the evening settling around her. Yet, despite the calm of the real world, her mind still lingered in the topsy-turvy landscapes of Wonderland. The strange creatures, the shifting logic, and the peculiar conversations all felt as vivid as ever. It was as though she had one foot in each world, one in the structured reality she had known all her life, and the other in a place where nonsense reigned, where imagination ran free, and where nothing was quite as it seemed. She traced a finger idly along the fabric of her dress, recalling her journey from the moment she first tumbled down the rabbit hole. She had started as an observer, a mere visitor to Wonderland's peculiarities. But as time had passed, she had found herself swept up in its madness. She had shrunk, grown, been mistaken for a serpent, played croquet with flamingos, debated with a caterpillar, and dined with a hatter who spoke in riddles. Every step of the way, she had struggled to make sense of a world that defied understanding. But as she sat there, she realized something. Perhaps Wonderland had never been meant to make sense. Perhaps it had been teaching her something entirely different, not about logic or order, but about the absurdity of rules, the power of perspective, and the strange way in which nonsense could sometimes reveal deeper truths. She thought of the trial, of the Queen of Hearts, of the way she had stood up against the illogical proceedings. At that moment, she had felt a rush of clarity, a sudden understanding that nothing in Wonderland could truly harm her unless she allowed it to. The creatures, the threats, the chaos, it had all been an illusion of power, just as the Queen's authority had been a facade. It was in that moment, she realized, that Wonderland had begun to unravel. The cards had turned against her, the Queen's screams had grown distant, and suddenly she had found herself waking back in the real world. Had Wonderland truly crumbled around her, or had she simply seen through its nonsense at last? Her sister stirred beside her, stretching as the sky darkened. "It's getting late," she said. "We should be heading home." Alice hesitated, glancing down at her hands. The golden glow of the setting sun made her fingers look different somehow, almost as though she were still shifting sizes as she had in Wonderland. For a fleeting moment, she half expected to look up and see the Cheshire cat's grin hovering in the air, or to hear the white rabbit's frantic voice muttering about time. But there was nothing, only the gentle rustle of the breeze and the distant chirping of birds. She took a deep breath and rose to her feet, brushing off her dress. She had spent so much time trying to understand Wonderland, but perhaps its meaning had never been something to figure out. Perhaps it was simply an experience, something to remember. something to carry with her, even now that she had returned to the real world. As she and her sister began walking, Alice cast one last glance over her shoulder. Somewhere, deep in the recesses of her mind, she knew Wonderland still existed. Perhaps not as a place she could return to, but as a part of her that would never quite fade. As Alice walked alongside her sister, the world around her felt at once familiar and strangely different. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of purple and gold, and the grass beneath her feet rustled gently with the evening breeze. Yet, despite returning to the real world, a part of her still clung to Wonderland. It lingered in the corners of her mind, in the odd turns of phrase that had lodged themselves in her memory, in the feeling that somewhere, just out of reach, a grinning cat might be watching her. She wondered if anyone would believe her tale. If she described the Queen of Heart's ridiculous trial, the Mad Hatter's riddles, or the White Rabbit's frantic rush, would they simply laugh and tell her she had dreamed it all? Perhaps. But Alice knew that Wonderland had changed her. She had arrived there as a curious girl, eager to understand a world that made no sense. And now, as she returned to reality, she carried with her a new understanding not of answers, but of questions. Wonderland had shown her that not everything needed to be logical, that rules could be questioned, and that imagination was as powerful as reality itself. As her sister spoke to her, Alice nodded absently, lost in thought. She knew that life would go on as it always had, with its rules and lessons and expectations. But inside, she would always hold onto that secret knowledge that somewhere beyond the ordinary, there existed a place where the impossible was possible, where words twisted into games, and where one could grow and shrink and grow again without ever truly changing who they were. Alice's adventure had ended, but the story of Alice's adventures in Wonderland was only just beginning. Since its publication in 1865, Lewis Carroll's novel has captivated generations of readers, delighting both children and adults with its imaginative world, playful language, and whimsical characters. More than just a simple fantasy tale, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland has been analyzed for its deeper themes: philosophy, logic, identity, and the absurdity of societal rules. It has inspired countless adaptations, from films and plays to artwork and music, each new interpretation adding another layer to the wonder that Carroll created. The book's significance lies not only in its storytelling, but in the way it challenges readers to think beyond convention. Alice's journey is more than just a fantastical romp through a dream world. It is a reflection on growing up, questioning authority, and embracing the unexpected. The Mad Hatter's riddles, the Queen's tyranny, and the ever-elusive Cheshire cat all serve as symbols of a world that is not as straightforward as it seems. Even today, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland remains one of the most beloved and enduring works of literature, a story that continues to spark imagination and curiosity in readers of all ages. Its legacy is proof that sometimes the most nonsensical stories hold the deepest truths, and that every once in a while, it's worth following a white rabbit just to see where the adventure leads.